Greetings, everyone. My name is Jessica Masterson, and I have a video presentation for your docent training today. It's called School Tours, Putting It All Together. That's the theme of today's tour, thinking about how to kind of cobble together all of these pieces of knowledge that now you've gained, and of course the experience that you already bring to the table in order to make a meaningful tour for your students. So first, I would like to start with introductions, and if I were there in person, we would all, of course, go around and share our names and a little bit about our interest in art, interest in museums, interest in education. But I'll just share a little bit about myself. So I'm an assistant professor in the ISU Department of Teaching and Learning. Before that, I was a grad student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And before that, I taught 7th and 8th grade language arts in Hawaii. So while I was in Hawaii teaching 7th and 8th grade, I got a couple of master's degrees, one in American Studies with a focus on museum studies and another in education. And it was super exciting to bring my 7th and 8th grade students to the Honolulu Museum of Art. We did a lot of cool partnerships. They also had a pretty cool contemporary art museum. Now it's called the Spalding House, and they really made an overt effort to ensure that the experiences my students had there were deeply educational and were unique experiences that students couldn't get in my classroom otherwise. So here's the gorgeous Honolulu Museum of Art, which I would highly recommend if you're ever in Hawaii. And then for my PhD, again, I was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I did a lot of work at the Sheldon Museum of Art there. So I started as an education intern, and then I took over designing the curriculum and implementing the curriculum for docent training, which was really, really exciting. And then I eventually, once I started dissertating, I became a docent and I would volunteer and I led tours, and it was just so much fun. So I wanted to include an interior picture of the Sheldon down here. It's just so gorgeous. So thinking about putting our tours together, I wanted to start with just sort of a think, pair, share activity. So if you're close to someone, feel free to turn to them and talk about this question. How do you typically organize your tours? Are there specific considerations perhaps that you have in mind? What kinds of things dictate how you organize your tours? So take just a couple minutes and share that, and please feel free to pause this video in the meantime. All right, so if you are with a group of people, please feel free to share your responses to that Think, Fair, Share as well. But I'm hoping that you are all kind of thinking about sort of maybe the invisible ways that your tours are already organized. And we're just going to draw on those invisible organizational strategies. We're going to try to bring them to the fore and organize tours a little bit more thoughtfully and consciously if we're not already doing that. So I want to start with a little bit of theory. I'm a huge fan of John Dewey. He's a turn of the century American educational philosopher. He's part of the pragmatist school. He's done a lot of really cool things, and his ideas were certainly radical in the early 1900s when he was writing, and I find them to be very radical today. But here's something from John Dewey in a very nice book called Experience in Education. So he writes, "What avail is it to win prescribed amounts of information about geography and history, to win ability to read and write, if in the process the individual loses his own soul, loses his appreciation of things worthwhile, of the values to which these things are relative, if he loses desire to apply what he has learned, and above all, loses the ability to extract meaning from his future experiences as they occur." So this is a lot. And, obviously in some ways it shows that it was written over 100 years ago. But particularly that first part where he's asking us, okay, so our students can win these prescribed little nuggets of information, these random tidbits. And what good does that do them unless they're able to apply them, unless they're able to reflect on prior experiences and use that reflection to drive their future action. This is the central core of Dewey's work. And when we think about that, I want us to think about our own tours. Oftentimes, a tour can be sort of just a smorgasbord, if you will, of prescribed amounts of information about artists, about techniques, just a lot of information being shared with students. And it's good information, it's important information, it's awesome, intriguing information. But if there's no opportunity for students to reflect on it, there's no opportunity for them to see sort of a connective tissue among these pieces, then, if we ascribe to Dewey's view, it doesn't actually help them out in the end that much. They may have sort of a fuzzy idea of what it is exactly they've learned. So Dewey's big thing is this concept of continuity. And from a Deweyan perspective, he says, in order to learn, the experiences we provide our students must have this continuity, this clear thread throughout them that students recognize and can notice, can observe as we move art object to art object. So continuity requires that students understand how all the bits of information we're giving them fit together. I have an example that I thought of, and maybe it's a strange example, but I'm recently married. I was married almost coming up on a year ago, and my partner and I received as a gift from very beloved people in our lives a set of dinner chargers. You can see in the bottom right. And they were lovely. I was very confused, though, about what a charger was. It looked a whole lot like a dinner plate in my view, and yet puzzlingly, on the package and then labeled on each of the individual chargers was a little sticker that said, "Not food safe." So I was totally confused because here's something that looks a lot like a plate, and yet I'm not supposed to eat off of it. And I think about this example when I'm thinking about tours, when I'm thinking about like just throwing information at students, because I had no context. If I had had some help, and eventually, Google is there, so that was nice in that case, but I had to take some time and figure out where in sort of the connective tissue in my brain this charger would fit. So I had to realize that it's related to, dinnerware generally, and it is apparently just another additional plate that maybe keeps your food warm or is a decorative element. But again, just kind of being sent this gift out of the blue, it didn't make much sense to me because I didn't know any of the context surrounding it. So consider that. It's a wonky, perhaps clunky analogy. But think about sometimes how the information that we share with our students during tours might be like a dinner charger coming to me, where it's just like, okay, I see this and I have no idea how it connects to anything else. I would also suggest that without attention to continuity, again, building on this charger metaphor, our students may not have a strong sense of what they learned, right? When their parents or guardians ask them, "What did you do with the SWOPE today?" They might say, "Oh, well, I saw some art." And maybe the parent or guardian probes and says, "Well, what specifically? What did you talk about?" And they might say, "I don't know." And that's not what we want, right? We ideally would want them to have a pretty clear sense of what it was that they learned, what it was that they talked about. And I think a little bit about Monty Python, and specifically their sort of refrain in some of their shows. And I'm hoping some of you know what I'm talking about. But often their transition between segments was simply to say, "And now for something completely different." And if we think about tours, oftentimes that's the transition, right? We're looking at this gorgeous landscape, let's say, and then we transition to the Robert Motherwell, and it's something completely different. And again, that doesn't help so much with this idea of continuity and trying to figure out how all of these pieces fit together. So consider right now, and if you want to do this individually, and again, pause this video for a few seconds, that's totally fine, and I encourage that. When you think about your students, when you think about the tour groups that you lead, What is it that you want your students to get out of their tour? What is it that you would hope that they would tell their parent or their guardian, perhaps about the nature of art, perhaps something about a specific art object that you spent a lot of time with? What is it that you want them to hold on to even after they've left the SWOPE? Okay, so thinking about those ideas that you just generated in that little thought experiment, I'm going to suggest that remember those, hold on to those, because those could be helpful in generating a tour using what I'm calling essential questions. And I shouldn't say I'm calling it, that makes it sound as though it's my brilliant idea, and essential questions are not my brilliant idea. They're something that were popularized maybe in the last 20 years or so of education, public education, and education research. And so the idea here is that when we're designing a unit of study, let's say in an English classroom, we want to apply backward design. So we want to begin with the end in mind. And the pioneers of backward design, Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, suggest having what they call an essential question that organizes the entire unit of study. So what I am doing here, what I think is maybe my unique contribution, is taking this idea out of the realm of formal education and thinking about it in the realm of informal education, thinking about it for use in the museum. So an essential question is, of course, a question, and it's one that inspires a quest for knowledge and discovery. It encourages and develops critical thinking processes. It is all about possibilities, so it's open-ended. It doesn't have an easy answer. It helps to focus students' learning, so they know exactly what they're focusing on, what they're supposed to be thinking about. And when we're thinking about essential questions and introducing them on a tour, we want to be mindful that these should be phrased in kid-friendly language, in language that a kid could easily glom onto. So here are some examples of art-based essential questions. Some of these I Googled, some of these I wrote. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and indeed, I think you all will have great insights in terms of generating essential questions that are relevant for our particular students here in Terre Haute. So here are some examples. You might say, how does an art object communicate with us? What is art and why is it important? How do artists use their art to bring about positive change? How can we read a work of art? How do our life experiences influence how we see a work of art? What is a portrait? How do artists translate personality traits onto a canvas? How do artists portray our region? What are the themes or subjects they explore and why? And then, of course, the most important bullet point down here, what are your essential questions? So again, thinking back to that individual reflection just a few minutes ago, thinking about what you want students to get out of their tours with you, that could help, that could be phrased in a question, right? That could be something that you take and maybe massage a bit such that it is an open-ended question for your students to explore. So let me give you an example of sort of what this looked like when I was at the Sheldon Museum of Art in Lincoln, Nebraska. So that was a collection that I came to know really well. I don't know the SWOPE collection very well at all, in all truth, but I know you do. And you are the experts on this collection. But just to give you an example of what this might look like. So yeah, this question of what is a portrait, that was one that, you know, it seems pretty open and shut to begin with, but then based on the really cool items in our collection that were on view, I realized actually it doesn't have a clear answer to it. It could actually be quite complex. And so just to give you an idea of like the smattering of portraits that I found throughout the galleries, these are all parts of different shows. So it wasn't a gallery about portraiture per se, right? First, we had an unknown piece or an unknown artist titled Portrait of a Lady. We had a portrait of Jackson Pollock by Robert Arneson. We had this sculpture by Bruce Conner. It's supposed to be a portrait of George Helms. It is. I mean, Conner says it is, so it is, right? And then we had, probably the most prized piece in all of our collection, the Sheldon, was this Brancusi, Princess X, which is a portrait based on Marie Bonaparte. So already, again, as I'm like going through the galleries, as I'm putting together information for docents about each of these pieces, it occurred to me, wow, cool. We could actually do some deep digging about what a portrait is, because artists are challenging that genre in some interesting ways that I think might surprise some of our 5th grade students. Okay, so I've identified these pieces. I've identified this essential question. And here are the basic steps I would urge you to follow as you're getting these pieces together in order to put them into an order that makes sense. First, explore. So if you have an essential question already, fantastic, or you know one that you'd like to explore, wonderful. It also might come about the other way. You might need to spend some time walking around the galleries, looking for similar themes or similar works of art. So it might come about sort of organically in that way. But yes, first is that exploratory step where you're just trying to get some interesting ideas. Then when you've got your essential question, and perhaps you have several pieces that you think could fit within that essential question, you might consider the ideal order of those pieces. Now, granted, it won't always happen that way, because we know in tours, right, sometimes you want to enter a gallery, but that one is full, so you gotta go to plan B and go somewhere else. But assuming that all goes as planned, what would be the ideal order to take your students through? Also, crucially, consider the transitions, right? Rather than, and now for something completely different. What is the connective tissue that will take you from one piece to the other? What do you want students to be thinking about when they leave their discussion of one piece and they move to another? And then finally, after you have the sort of the meat and potatoes of your tour together, I do want you to give some thought to the introduction and to the conclusion of your tour. These are often parts of a tour that I think are neglected, because sometimes the start is very chaotic, and often the ending can be very chaotic too. Like, oh, it's time to go. Bye, everyone. But these are really important pieces as we seek to inspire reflection among our students. These are opportunities, first of all, to introduce that essential question, and then at the end to have students reflect on what they've learned. In the case of a portrait, how has their understanding of what a portrait can be and what it does changed over the course of the last 15 minutes or so? So taking these steps and putting them into practice, again, I had my essential question, what is a portrait? And at the start of the tour, I decided it would be wise to just take some time to generate a group definition of a portrait. So with my 12 students or so, we would talk. We would just turn and talk, and then maybe go to the whole group, like, what is a portrait? Some kids may not know. That's totally fine. Some kids probably have a very clear idea. It's a painting of a famous person, right? That was often a definition that was generated by the group. Okay, so a painting of a famous person. Cool. And then what we would do at each stop on the tour is come back to that definition and maybe revise it a bit, maybe change it a bit. So first stop, right? Here we have an unknown artist and this piece called Portrait of a Lady. It is indeed a painting, right? It is indeed something that they would recognize as a portrait pretty easily. And yet, do we know this person? No. She's not necessarily famous, but it still counts as a portrait. Okay, so what's our definition now? A painting of a person. Cool. Then we go to Jackson. And here they'll be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And they'll talk about, we can have interesting conversations about the style here and the media. And this is also kind of a cool place to talk a little bit about Jackson Pollock, right? How is it fitting that this is a portrait of Jackson Pollock, using this very particular style that we might associate with Jackson Pollock? So here, right, the lines aren't as clearly defined. It's not as kind of photorealist as the previous one. Okay, so we're thinking, okay, so painting, but It can look a variety of different ways. But still, this meets that technical definition, that hypothetical definition that fifth graders might give me. And then we move to Princess X, right? And so I'm thinking, the transition between this piece and this piece might be like, okay, so we said it's a painting of a person. Think about that as we go and see our next piece. Then I bring them to Princess X, which often inspired a little bit of laughter from students. It is a very strange shape, to be sure. And so then here I say, okay, well, this is a portrait of Marie Bonaparte. And I can tell them a little bit about how she was said to be very vain. And so these little marks here, if you can kind of see, are kind of finger marks. So she's perhaps got one hand sort of extended behind her, resting on her back. And then on the other side that we can't see so well over here, the shoulder is dropped. And she was supposedly a very vain lady. And so that dropped shoulder, supposedly, is sort of, it's evoking her looking into her mirror that she's carrying with her bottom right hand. So lots to do and lots to talk about here. But then again, we're deepening that definition of what a portrait is and can do. And then, again, ideally, this would be the fourth piece that we look at within this particular essential question tour. Because, wow, this at least, the Brancusi at least has the sort of a basic form of a human. You can kind of see that. But it's even more abstracted, I would say, in this Connor piece, right? So again, the thinking here, like if I had my druthers, I would move in this order. But of course, I'm always thinking too, like what if all the galleries with these pieces are totally full and I have to start with Bruce Connor? How do I start there, right? But it's an important consideration. So I could say we could just start straight off with just letting them know that their initial conception of portraiture is going to be blown up, right? And we can talk about this. And this at least has sort of it looks, I guess, somewhat like a human form in that we've got a head, we've got a box for a body, we've got some legs, some tapering down there. But yeah, so as you're thinking about transitions, think about what if I had to start with a Brancusi, or what if I wanted to start with a Jackson this time? How could I, again, strengthen that connective tissue, no matter the order of the pieces that I bring the students to? And then at the end of the tour, with the last few minutes that we had, we would go to our initial definition, which I would sometimes just jot down on a notepad that I would carry. And then we would once again work as a group to revise our definition of what a portrait is based on all the pieces we had seen, right? And again, the hope there is that they have something specific that they're leaving with. We talked about portraitures. And yes, they did see a ton of different pieces here, a nice variety, which is something I know a lot of us care about when we're bringing students in for possibly the first and maybe hopefully not the only time, but sometimes the only time. It's important that they get to see a wide variety of things. And here I've got a wide variety, right? All within the theme of portraiture. All right. That is the end of my presentation today. I have a sort of planning sheet that I'm going to send to Hilda that you all can use if it's helpful. I'm just basically trying to walk you through those steps of putting together a tour, thinking about essential questions. But crucially, right, now is the time for exploration, whether that's trying to come up with an essential question and then looking at the pieces in the SWOPE to figure out what might fit, or again, just walking around the galleries, trying to figure out some common themes, some cool connections that you could make, and devising an essential question from what is already there. So thank you all so much for your time and your attention, and best of luck.